Ooh, that's smooth. Now, if you're one of those guys that thinks an older firearm is always better than a newer one, I'm here to tell you it ain't necessarily so. And if you'll stick with me, I'm going to give you a perfect example of that. Hi, George here, and welcome to Tales from Target Suite, where I'll share my perspective on guns and shooting, and we'll spend some time at the range, and every now and then we'll reconvene out in my shop back in Houston, or at the farm in Louisiana, where I'll build some fun projects, and we'll share an adventure or two that'll make even a grown man smile. And so, what do you think about my new studio? Actually, it's not a new studio. We're at my son and daughter-in-law's house in Seguin, Texas to celebrate Christmas 2019. That's tomorrow. And right now, most of the family is either napping or shopping or cooking. And so I had a few minutes to run out here and try to put together a little video for you guys before we settle down for Christmas. And that video is going to be about my new Marlin Model 1894. If you watched my earlier video, it was actually a couple of weeks ago as YouTube time flies. If you watched my earlier video about the Marlin 1894, you'll know that that particular rifle, which was made in 1974, was a mess. It wouldn't chamber a round, it wouldn't allow a round to come out of the magazine tube, and it had some other issues like a sight that was front sight that was glued on. And so I'd hoped that I could get it all cleaned up, fix those issues, and it would turn out to be a really nice working model. But it didn't happen that way. It had bigger issues that I was not prepared to resolve. And so I sent it back to the seller. And he was gracious enough to accept the return outside of the 3-day window, so I was appreciative of that. And then I found this rifle on gunbroker.com, and it looked to be really nice, a really nice specimen. And so I pulled the trigger, as they say figuratively, and bought it. Okay, I need to make a really big correction here. I did identify this model on Gunbroker and I made the transaction, but it's really a Christmas gift from my son and my wife. Thank you so much. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at this rifle and see how it compares. This particular one was made in 1979. See how it compares to one that was made 5 years earlier. Now, as you could tell, it's smooth. The action is really smooth. And compared to the one from 1974, it's way better. But that's subjective. And so let's get this thing taken apart and see if we can find anything concrete that would speak to the quality of this firearm versus one that was made 5 years earlier. So let's get started. First thing we're going to have to do is take off the scope, and I've already loosened these screws. Okay, the first thing I noticed was the ejector is a much nicer design. It actually has a machined part here with a spring on it. The one from the 1974 version was just one formed spring. And so this is a much nicer, more robust ejector than from the earlier model. The next thing I noticed is that the carrier, as dirty as it is is in much nicer shape. I'm not really sure if somebody had modified that rifle, but it had a different carrier than this one. Another thing that's different is the spring on the loading gate here is a much thinner spring, and so when flexing the loading gate to load rounds, it's much easier on your fingers to get rounds into the magazine. So those are all goodness. And then the real big one is the machining marks that were right here on the 1974 version are missing. In other words, this is a really smooth machined surface, whereas, as you can see, the 1974 version had big chatter marks. So a really obvious manufacturing defect from the 1974 to this version, the 1979. And also, as I look down inside, things appear to be a little neater, and even though they're also filthy like that other rifle, things just seem to be cut a little nicer than on that 1974 version. So all in all, there are some differences right here in the receiver that we can tell between the two rifles. Now, let's take this fore end off and see what we find. Okay, now one of the most dramatic differences between this rifle and the 1974 version is the fact that the magazine tube is not under tension. In other words, it's basically parallel to the barrel and can just come right out. The 1974 version was really under tension, and the reason was, and let me go ahead and take this apart. The reason it was under such tension is because just like the machining right here was really poorly done and with lots of chatter marks, the relief cut here for the magazine tube was just as poorly machined. And so in order to get the magazine tube to go in, it had to go in like this and then bend around material that was not machined away properly right here. And so what we wound up with was a magazine tube that was grotesquely bent. And so that's probably the largest and most, although it didn't affect the functionality of loading around in the chamber, it was just another example of really poor machining work. Okay, well there you have it. We found some really significant manufacturing issues or differences between the 1979 version and the 1974 version. The significant ones that point to quality control were the chatter marks on the interior of the receiver right here, the general cleanliness of the machining work down inside here was both of those are much better here on the 1979 version than they were in the 1974 version. And another real big issue was the relief cut on the bottom of the barrel, the clearance cut for the magazine tube. It was not cut properly on the 1974 version, and so in order to assemble that rifle, they had to actually bend the magazine tube. And so those are really big quality control problems that they addressed between 1974 and 1979. So this is clearly a time when an older rifle is not as well made as a newer rifle, even though it's only 5 years. Maybe someday we'll compare this rifle with a modern Marlin Model 1894. And so, hey, if you haven't already, please hit subscribe. I need those subscribers. And I wish you the merriest of Christmases. And we'll see you in the next video when I hope we're going to shoot this rifle. Take care and see you then.